continuing the portion of Noach that we're reading this week. The question that we ask today is, what do you think? Are compliments a good thing? Let me ask you, what's better? Or what are we better at? Complimenting or criticizing? Come on, be honest, my friends. Which one is it? Which one tends to be the easier or the more natural way we do things? Complimenting or criticizing?
We're good at criticizing.
We're good at criticizing. Why do you think it is? Why do you think that is?
Because that's our Yetzer Hara. We're just so... I don't know. It's natural.
Is it because we have certain expectations? We expect people to do things right, so when they do it right, well, that was expected. That's my thinking. But if you did it wrong, I better tell you did it wrong, right? Maybe that's what it is. Yeah. Now, of course, there are some people who are hesitant to dispense compliments, and the irony is that it doesn't cost us anything to compliment people. You know, what does it cost to tell somebody that they did something well? What does it cost to heap praise on somebody? But for some reason, we're cheap at it, even though it doesn't cost us anything. And even when we do give compliments from time to time, we obviously are aware that it's easier to criticize than to offer honest praise. And we often justify that. You know, we say, why do we need to compliment someone for doing a good job? What for? Right? What do we say about our kids? A child should not be accustomed to too many compliments, people think. Well, you know, they have to do the right thing altruistically, without seeking compliments and attention. So we seem to think that complimenting, you know, and I don't profess to know the good reason for it. I'm just discussing this with you here. And maybe you have a good reason of why you think it is, why we don't tend to be as praising, as abundant, as generous with our praises as we are with criticism. Now, of course, there are many, ways to look at it and to understand it, and I'm sure there's a whole science behind it. I once heard of what's the term for it? It's the broken tile syndrome. You know what the broken tile syndrome says? You walk into a room, and there are thousands of perfect tiles. All of them look just fine. But there's one that's cracked. Which one will you notice? Which one? Don't be so shy, my friends. We tend to notice the broken one, right? Everything is good. We notice the cracks. We notice the flaws. We notice the shortcomings of people. And maybe even of ourselves. Maybe we are so self-critical of ourselves, and that's why we tend to be critical of others. Maybe if we loved ourselves more, we could be more loving of others. I don't know.
I think it's a new buzzword. It's this cognitive dissonance. Cognitive
dissonance certainly is where we are aware of something and yet we don't do it. The professor who tells us how bad it is to smoke and yet smoke cigarettes themselves. It is the rabbi who is preaching about all sorts of things and yet it does not fulfill themselves. At the end of the day, we all have one sermon. And that one sermon is ourselves, how we behave. But we recognize as well that we're human beings. And as much as we are critical perhaps of others, perhaps we're self-critical as well, we recognize we're aware of our own shortcomings. And that's part of the cognitive dissonance. So while, of course, we realize that there is, perhaps the shortcomings of others and ourselves as well. I'm not sure who said this, but I once read a quote. A person usually has two reasons for doing something. A good reason and the real reason. And unfortunately, human nature appears to be predisposed to be more critical. We're criticism. I took a Dale Carnegie course many years ago, and they're the 3 C's that he tells us, and yet I often fail at it. And those are don't condemn, don't criticize, don't complain. And right here I am, being broadcast on YouTube, on Facebook, on Zoom, with many participants. And I tell you straight up, as much as I wish I listened to the advice of Dale Carnegie and all the others, I also tend to be critical as well. But now that we got that out of the way, that I am just as vulnerable to these pitfalls, let's talk about how to try to improve in those. And of course, we want to seek advice from the Parsha, because we know that when we criticize other people, we are deflecting our own failures. We're projecting them onto others. That's what the Baal Shem Tov told us. That when we see a flaw, when we see a shortcoming, a failure in somebody else, it's really a reflection of ourselves. And that's why a tzaddik, a righteous person, a holy person, we're going to talk about tzaddikim today too, they don't tend to do that, because they are content with themselves. And when one is happy with their own disposition, they don't see the flaws in others. They see the good, the beauty in others. So when we could see good in ourselves, we could actually see the good in others as well. When we're seeing flaws in others, the Baal Shem Tov says we are seeing the flaws in ourselves. Now, if someone else is also unspectacular, then our own mediocrity is safe from self-criticism. By me seeing the flaw in somebody else, I'm covering up my own pitfalls. On the other hand, the ability to offer praise, to shower others and sing their praises, that is a sign of a good-hearted person who's able to overcome their own insecurities and to truly see the good in another. Even if that means that maybe the other person will outshine me. Maybe I'm not going to be as impressive, but that itself is a good sign that we should be working in ourselves. And that's something we're going to talk about today from the portion of Noach. So I open today's question to you as follows. What do you think is the Jewish view towards offering compliments? Do you think it's something we should be striving more towards? You know, the story is told of a young art protege who was instructed by one of the great artists of his time, or her time. And when he completed his studies, the great artist instructed the student to display his latest work that he just finished painting as part of the course. Next to the art, he was to hang a sign with these words: I've just completed an art course, and this is one of the first pieces of art that I've produced. Please write down any criticism on the bottom of the sign. What happened? The budding young artist stood next to his artwork, and he received the greatest disappointment of his life. It seemed as if every passerby was an amateur art critic. Every person stopped and pointed out some problem, some flaw. You see this is wrong, that's wrong, the other thing is wrong. And he couldn't possibly believe what an utter and total failure he was at art. After an hour, he felt as if his entire career was finished. That's it, he's done. He would never be able to succeed as an artist. All his hopes and dreams were ripped to shreds. At his side, the great artist watched this entire scene unfold, all the while not saying a word. And finally, he felt that he saw enough, and he instructed a student to go back to the studio and pick out another recently completed piece of art. This time, he gave him the exact same instructions with one key difference in the inscription that he was to write. It said, I have just completed an art course, and this is one of the first pieces of art that I've produced. Please write on the bottom of this sign how I can improve upon the beauty of this painting. And this time, nobody stopped to offer comments or suggestions. The painting, somehow there was no help anyone had, no praise, no comments, no compliments. People just glanced at the painting. They looked at the sign and they carried on. And the student was astounded. What was going on here? So the artist explained, you see, it's really very simple. There's no failing in your art. You have nothing to be ashamed of. I wanted to demonstrate that people rush to offer criticism. It's so easy for people to criticize, but it's very difficult for people to offer something constructive, something positive, some praise. So the criticism is not a reflection of your art. It's only a vehicle for people to express their own self-disappointment. So what do? They see your art. They say, your art has problems. I did this exact same little experiment myself. We used to, after our retreats, my wife and I, send out a self-criticism email, a little bit asking for critique. We thought it would be helpful and constructive in us improving in our retreats. And you know what we discovered? That when we asked for critique, boy, do we get it. And people would just berate us. So to say, there was a wonderful retreat, they had a great time. And all we were asking for is areas we could improve. And yet, for some strange reason, I discovered, and my wife did as well, and it was quite demoralizing actually, to see how people only had critical things to say. So instead, we have now a very short, a very different type of post-retreat, what would you call it, a questionnaire. And in that questionnaire, we sort of ask, of course, we direct people into the areas of where we want them to give us constructive critique, but we just didn't want to put it out there and make people to be so critical because we haven't found that to be beneficial in any real way. And of course, this is our question. What is the Jewish view? What is the Jewish perspective on criticism or on offering compliments? Does the Torah condone it? Does the Torah encourage? Should we be critical of others? Should we be offering compliments to others? Does the Torah view, what is the Torah's perspective on this? Is it vain? Is it beneficial? Should we withhold compliments for our actions? You know, when you see people do something right, should we be complimenting them? Should we be criticizing them? Right? Does the Torah demand the mitzvahs be done altruistically for the sake of heaven, l'shem shamayim, without the need for any kind of praise, without a pat on the back? So that's something we're going to look at today from the Parsha this week. Personally, this is one of the topics that I've talked about very many times, and I feel that it's an important topic to discuss because it's something that we could all use some improvement on. I won't condemn, criticize, or complain to anybody. I will just share with you some insights from the Torah portion this week and see how we can implement them. So, of course, let's see our Parsha, and not only our Parsha. If I go back to last week's Parsha, at the very beginning of Bereshit, we'll see already how the Torah looks at this. And it appears that the Torah is inconsistent, actually. It's meting out praise for some great individuals, and yet at the same time, the Torah is very quiet, shtum, as we say, shashtil, about some others. So what's the correct thing? You know, for example, if we look in last week's Parsha, very end of last week's Parsha, we see how the Torah introduces Mesushelach. I'm not sure how you say his name in English. Methuselah, something like that. And Mesushelach, the Torah gives us a very praiseworthy description of him. You could see it at the end of last week's Parsha. It's chapter 5, verse, let me just find it quickly in my Chumash here, verse 27, the very end of Bereshis. And the Mesushelach, we know, is very famous for having the longest lifespan mentioned in the Torah. And what does the Torah say here about him? Vayiyu kol yemei mesushelach teisha v'shishim. No, that the lifespan of mesushelach was how many years? Torah tells us here was 969 years. Vayamas, and he died. So, from a surface view of the text, obviously nothing seems to stand out about Mesushelach, just that he had extremely long life. But if we look at Rashi's commentary here, Rashi fills us in about Mesushelach. Let me just read to you Rashi's words. Rashi tells us that in fact Mesushelach was a very holy person, and his death caused the flood to be delayed by a full week. Says Rashi here about Mesushelach. Let me read it to you. Says Rashi in our parsha, God says another 7 days it will take until the flood, the mabul, the deluge will begin. And Rashi tells us that that's actually the verse. But Rashi says, Elu shivas yemei evloi shel Mesushelach hatzadik. These are the 7 days of mourning for Mesushelach shechasa kadosh baruch al kfoidei, because Hashem was concerned, was considerate for his honor, ve'ike v'saparanius, and therefore God delayed the retribution. Ironically, a few minutes ago I got off the phone with somebody who just lost his brother and was planning a big event this week. This week we were planning a big event, a big celebration in his family, and unfortunately had to delay that because of the passing of his brother. So, just ironically that we're reading this right here in our parsha. So the Torah is telling us that the reason God delayed this incident, this flood, the deluge, the mabul, was because as an honor of Mesushelach, because of his passing. Now, this omission is not a one-time occurrence where the Torah doesn't mention. It's Rashi that fills us in the details, because there are many other great personalities in the Torah. For example, when the Torah describes Chanoch, who's known as Enoch, who was the father of Mesushelach, what does the Torah say? Vayishalech Chanoch es Elokim. The Torah describes Chanoch as walking in the ways of God. Ve'einenu, and then he was no longer. Ki lakach es Elokim, because God had taken. That's how the Torah describes the death, the passing of Chanoch. So it doesn't tell us that he died. The Torah says he was no longer. Now the sages teach that Chanoch did not pass away in the conventional sense. Rather, he experienced a transformation. And we're told that he became the angel, the Malach Matatron. And I won't go into the details of it, but this is explained in the Medrash, and that's, he sort of transformed into an angel. The only other person I could think of in biblical history who had the same experience is, anyone know? Eliyahu HaNavi, Elijah the prophet. So, here we have the Torah's description of these great individuals, and yet the Torah doesn't tell us too much. It's the commentaries that tell us about their greatness and filling in those details. But in the opening of our parsha this week, what do we read about Noach? What does the Torah say? Eile toldos Noach. These are the offspring, the generations of Noach. Noach ish tzaddik. Noach was a righteous person. Tamim Haya b'deraisa, he was perfect in his generations. I want you to keep track of these words because we're going to have to get back to them just now. Es Elokim es halach Noach. Noach walked with God. Now, before we dissect these words and understand the the complexity and the nuances in the entire Tanakh. I think, I might stand to be corrected, but I think this is the sole instance where the Torah gives the title of tzaddik to a particular individual. Avraham Avinu, Sarah Imenu, Yitzchak and Rivka, Yaakov Avinu, his wives, none of them are called tzaddik. Not even Moshe Rabbeinu or Aaron HaKohen. The only one who's called, pardon?
Yosef. What about Yosef?
Give me a verse in the Torah where Yosef is called a tzaddik.
No,
it's not in the Torah.
No.
It's in the book of Amos. Okay? Yeah. So it's not even it's not clearly written in the Torah. We refer to Yosef HaTzadik because in the book of Amos, he is referred to in that way. But the Torah does not call anyone else, as far as I know, but thanks for that. I checked it up before, that's how I knew. That was a question I had as well. But except for Noach, and yes, of course, you're right that we call Yosef HaTzadik, but that's based on the prophet, on the scriptures in Amos. He is called Tzaddik in his time, in his generation. Es Elokim, it says about him that Es Elokim is Halach Noach, that Noach walked with God. So the Torah goes out of its way to bestow these titles on Noach, and that's not, you speak of Noach with all these great descriptions. Noach is righteous, he is tamim, he is complete, he walks in the ways of God. There's nobody else that I could think of that the Torah describes with such lavish praise. And it's not just once. Let's go forward a few more verses. The beginning of chapter 7 in our Parsha, we read this yesterday, where Hashem tells Noach to go into the ark. And what does Hashem say to him? Ki oischa ra'isi tzadik lefanai badar hazeh. Again, God says to him, because you are the only righteous person in this generation. Again, remember the nuance that the sages comment about, specifically why it mentions in his generation. We'll get back to that just now. But the Medrash learns a very interesting lesson by comparing these two verses, that the Torah mentions 3 distinct praises of Noach. And yet in this verse, he's only called a tzaddik. Says the Medrash on this verse, Rebbe Eliezer ben Azariah said, Matzinu shayim miktsas shivcha shel adam mefanav. Rashi comments on this, that we find that here that we only say part of a person's praise in their presence. When you're speaking about a person, you sing all their praises. But in front of a person's face, you don't want to make them blush too much. So that's why the verse only says, in his presence, God says, you are righteous. But when talking about Noach, it says, he was righteous, he was complete, he walked in the ways of God. So the Medrash teaches us that we only mention part of the praise in a person's presence. At the same time, God still finds it important to tell Noach to his face that he's a righteous person. So yes, behind his back, talking about Noach, we even sing more of his praises. So the question, of course, is, what was it that was so great about Noach? That Noach possessed, what quality did Noach possess? That God refers to Noach here with such lavish praises. And why are these praises mentioned not once, but twice in the Torah? No one else is called a tzaddik. Was Noach really more praiseworthy than Avram Avinu and Sarah Imenu? Than Moshe and Aaron and all the others?
Rabbi, could it be that the others were so bad, and in comparison, Noach stood out to be the tzaddik because everyone else was so bad?
You're saying everybody else in his time was so bad?
Yes.
But what about Avraham Avinu? Was he not a tzaddik?
Yes, of course.
Was Sarah Imenu not a tzaddikus?
Yes, but not in Noach's time.
True. So that's what we're asking is exactly that. But although this is Parshas Noach, the truth is the Torah already introduced him to us last week at the end of Parshas Bereshis. And it was mentioned, I think, twice in Parshas Bereshis. The first time it tells us when he's born, and the second time he's mentioned in contrast to all the wicked people of his time. We discussed yesterday, they were corrupt, they were promiscuous, they lived a terrible, they weren't good. But nevertheless, last week the Torah doesn't mention Noach's righteousness in last week's parsha. It's in our parsha. So if the Torah sees it so important and necessary to praise Noach, why does it wait until now? And you're absolutely right, because Rashi says your answer. It's part of the, Rashi's mentioning the Talmud, that in his time, of course, compared to all the terrible people of his time, he was very righteous. But I'm asking, why did we wait all the way till here? Why does the Torah not mention to us already when he's born, so you have a good point. Maybe only now, when we see him compared to the people of his time, is he considered righteous. But why does he get that title and not all the other great people? So, when you look in our parsha, what you're saying is absolutely true. Because it almost seems as if the Torah has a motive in mentioning his positive attributes, because you're comparing it to the rest of the people of his time. Right? The rest of the people, the word tzaddik, I guess, is relative. Who are you comparing him to? And that's what Rashi tells us. If you want to compare him, and that's why he says, B'dorasav, in his generation. If you want to compare him to the people of his generation, says Rashi, the people living in his generation were so corrupt, were so immoral, so unethical, they were so bad. So compared to them, of course, Noach was a tzaddik. Let me read it to you in Rashi's words. Rashi tells us here that, and Rashi refers us to the Medrash Tanchuma, where it says that, yes, this is praiseworthy to him only, let me just go back to Rashi. Give me a second. Let me find it. I'll mention 2 points. Firstly, Rashi says, since we mention his name, whenever we mention a righteous person, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, we should say that a righteous person's memory is always a blessing. So Noach was righteous. So we say he was a tzaddik, and we should remember the righteousness of the good that they brought, the blessing that they brought to the world. Another thing Rashi tells us is that the main righteousness of the main offspring, the good of the righteous, is their good deeds that carries on. But then Rashi tells us something else that's fascinating. Rashi says that there were different commentaries, and he quotes 2. Yesh merabbeseinu darshim oiseh l'shvach. He quotes this from the Gemara in Tractate Sanhedrin. Says some mention this as complementary to his benefit. They're saying that Rashi is quoting them. Why does it say Noach was righteous in his generation? Well, compared to the people of his time. Sorry, that's the second one. That's Lignai. That's to his detriment. Let's look at that. So one says he was righteous in comparison to the people living during his generation, during the people who lived in the generation of the flood. But if he had lived in the times of Abraham, those who see it detrimentally, they say, then compared to Abraham, he's not righteous. And it's interesting, they give an example. They say, for example, if a barrel of fragrant oil, so they say there's balsam oil, which has a weak aroma, then if it's placed in a filthy sea, even the one that has a weak odor, it's still going to be, its scent permeates the area. But if it's placed in another locality, to a clean area, then the weak odor is not going to be, it's not going to permeate the area. It's not going to be noticeable. It's not going to be discernible. But Rashi mentions the other opinion that sings his praises and says, if in such a generation Noach was able to stand up and withstand the pressures of his time, the peer pressure. How much more righteous he would have been had he lived in another generation. And for that example, the Talmud says, if a vial of a different type, of a stronger smelling oil is in a filthy place, it will give forth a fragrant, a pleasant fragrance and aroma. How much more pleasant would that fragrance be if it was placed in an attractive area? So according to one opinion, we're being told, and this is again, Rashi is telling us this is not his words. Rashi brings commentary from all over a plethora of Jewish sources. So he says this is from the Gemara Masechet Sanhedrin. And he's telling us that the Gemara is telling us, comparing Noach, the word righteous is relative. Compared to who? Now, who's the one who said, I don't know the name of Einstein, that his theory of relativity said a piece of hair. I was in somebody's office yesterday. He showed me, he said he got married very young because now he's completely bald. So he says, one hair on this bald guy's head, right? That's a lot. One hair in your bowl of soup. You know, what are you comparing it to? So comparing Noach, he was relatively righteous compared to the people of his time. But if he lived with the other greats, would he be considered as righteous? And if you want to look at it from the other perspective, that yes, he holds his own greatness, even compared to the other greats. Who is the one who said this? I think it was the Kotzker, Rabbi Mendel of Kotzk. He gave a vart, he called Noach a tzaddik in pelts. You ever heard of a tzaddik in pelts? Pelts is a fur coat. Therefore, Rabbi Mendel of Kotzk would say that on a cold day you have two options. One option is you can put on a coat, a fur coat, pelts, and now you are warm. Just you're warm. What if you were to light a fire? What would happen? Not only would you be warm, but all the people around you would be warm. So if you put on the coat, just you're warm. If you light a fire, you warm up everyone else around you. Said the Kotzker, Noach was tzaddik, he was a righteous person. But the fact that he didn't save anyone else in his generation, unlike Avraham Avinu and Moshe Rabbeinu, think about them. When God said he's going to destroy the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, what did Avraham do? Avraham argued with God and said, maybe there are 50 righteous people. He went all the way down to 10. When Hashem said to Moshe after the Jewish people betrayed God by worshiping the golden calf, God said, I will destroy this nation. I will annihilate them and start a new people from you, Moses. Did Moshe say, okay, great? No way. Moshe said, if that's the case, then you could erase me from your entire Torah. So the Kotzker Rebbe, Rabbi Menachem Mendel Morgenstern of blessed memory, his great-grandson, is a good friend of mine, Zeb Morgenstern. And this is a famous vart of his, where he says, Noach kept to himself. He didn't attempt to change the attitudes of the people around him. He got 120 years to build this ark. How many people did he rescue? A total of 9. And 8 of them were his own family. So, the idea that Noach was tzaddik, those who say it in the negative, to his detriment, were saying, not to in any way speak negatively about Noach per se, but to teach us a lesson. That when you have an opportunity to save others, be like Avraham and Moshe Rabbeinu. Save the world, light a fire. So that's one way of seeing it. In fact, to share with you another interesting medrash, it says, Rabbis banais asu chayil va'at alis al kulano. These are the words in we sing it on Friday nights, Eshet Chayil, right? Rabbis, if you come to my home, you'll see how every Friday night I try to serenade my wife with it. V'atolis al kulana. On that note, today my wife and I celebrate our 14th anniversary. So it's appropriate that we sing these words. There are many beautiful women out there, but as King Solomon said, you surpass them all. Says the Medrash on this. What is the meaning of Va'atalis al kolana, that you surpass them all? So the Medrash says something interesting. This is a reference to Moshe Rabbeinu, who surpassed all the others. And the Medrash says the difference between Moshe and Noach, that Moshe saved the people of his time. He said, you can erase me from the book. He was a faithful shepherd of his people, even though he himself was frustrated with them, no doubt. But Noach only succeeded in saving his immediate family. And one more person, Og Melech HaBashan, giant. But he failed to save the vast majority of humanity. After all the years that he had to build the ark. So that's one way of looking at this word, tzaddik. You could be tzaddik, you could be a good person. But are you only good to yourself and to those around you? Now, we know generally the Torah avoids negative remarks or terminology. And yet it makes an exception here. Since it's a matter that influences our personal conduct. So if we're left, I just want to analyze this properly, our questions. Question number 1. Why does the Torah heap all these praises on Noach? Right? If it does not use such praises when describing other great righteous people, and for this, some of the commentaries tell us that as righteous as Noach was, he wasn't the ideal tzaddik. And we asked before as well, why did we wait until this parsha, which we'll discuss now as well? But the reason why he's not an ideal tzaddik, very simply, is because Noach, as much as he was righteous, he was the tzaddik in pelts. He just warmed himself. What about rescuing and saving the other people? Now, we could argue that the people were so bad that Noach couldn't influence them. Maybe that's another way to see it. But the Torah doesn't say this. This is, by the way, just Medrash commentaries that give us this idea that he was the tzaddik in the fur coat. That was, the Kutzker saw it that way. But the Torah does tell us that compared to the other people in his time, the people in that generation were wicked. They were corrupt, they were immoral and unethical. They were promiscuous. So, the Kli Yakar, another beautiful and classic commentary on Torah. Kli Yakar is a very famous 16th century scholar. He studied in the yeshiva of the Maharshal, and he became, I think he was in Spain, I'm not sure. No, it couldn't have been in Spain if he was in the 1600s. Okay, I'm not sure where he was, but he was a very famous commentator. He was most renowned for his very fiery sermons, and was collected in this book called Kli Yakar, which is a precious vessel. And so he explains how each of the 3 qualities that the Torah describes Noach with, each one separates him from the sins, from the promiscuity, the wickedness, the immorality of the people in his generation. Let me share the words with you of the Kli Yakar. Remember the verse at the beginning of our parsha. What does it say? That Noach ish tzaddik, Noach was a righteous person. He was complete, and he walked with God. Says the Kli Yakar, a righteous person, in as much as that generation, they sinned in 3 ways. What were they? Number 1, they worshipped idols. Number 2, they were immoral. And number 3, they were thieves. They robbed. So the Torah is showing us in each of those ways that Noach was different. He didn't steal from other people. He wasn't immoral. He wasn't promiscuous. And he did not turn to other gods. He didn't worship idols. So that's one answer we saw from the Kli Yakar. Sorry I didn't give you the texts. I'll try maybe in some future classes to include more texts. But why wait until here? Why does the Torah not start to share his praise with us from the very beginning? We would first hear about Noach. In fact, the very end of last week's parsha, what did it say? I'm just going to move back there for a second. V'Noach matza chen b'einei Hashem. Torah tells us Noach found favor in the eyes of God. Maybe the Torah should tell us precisely how he found favor in God's eyes. Why keep us in suspense to this week to tell us how righteous he was? And the Kli Yakar tells us he was righteous compared to the people of his time because they were immoral, they were unethical, they were thieves. So, the comics tell the tale of Noach, and yet they tell it with a few subtle differences from the Torah. They say that God appeared to Noach. Right? God says there's going to be an impending flood. God instructed Noach to build an ark. We read yesterday the measurements, so-and-so cubits in width and cubits in length. And he then told him to inhabit the ark with 2 animals of each kind. After a long time had passed, a rain began to fall. That started the flood. God appeared again to Noach. Noach had nothing to show for his efforts. The supplies of the ark are there, unused, untouched. What is this, Noach? God asks him. You don't understand, Noach says to Hashem. I tried my hardest, but I was foiled at every step of the way. First, I had to get a building permit from the Johannesburg City Department. But then the neighbors blocked my request because they felt that it would drive down the property values in the neighborhood. Then I tried to gather the wood. Immediately I ran into difficulties with the environmentalists, those. They were opposed to me cutting down so much wood. We have to protect it. We have to preserve it. It's becoming an extinct species wood. Then the labor unions got in my case. I had to deal with them. The EFF was toying outside. When I finally gave up with it, started gathering the animals, the animal rights groups. All of a sudden, the SPCA came on my back. They gave me a headache. They insisted that I have to try to save more than 2 of every animal. God, I don't know how I'll ever be able to overcome all the red tape and the roadblocks. Slowly the rain stopped and the clouds began to disperse. And Noach looked hesitantly, looks up to the sky. So God, does this mean that he won't destroy the world? God says no. For all intents and purposes, man has done a good job destroying it on their own. That's just another way of looking at the story. By the way, you know why Noach couldn't play cards in the ark? Because he was standing on the deck. And even more so, he didn't want to play with a cheetah. Okay, all joking aside, I don't know if you guys are laughing or not. Oh, I can see a few reactions, good. So the story speaks to the challenges that Noach faced. He didn't need to contend with bureaucracy, but he did need to contend with the challenges of the population, the people that he faced around him in the world then. God was telling Noach to stand strong in the face of the unimaginable adversity that he faced. to build the ark for many, it took 120 years to build it. And yet he faced a lot of negativity, a lot of opposition, and he stood up to everyone. He stood up to all of the pressure and opposition that came his way. Says Rashi that it says by Noach, the verse says, Be'etzem hayom hazeh ba Noach. When Noach went into the ark, it says it was the middle of the day. Why? So Rashi in his commentary tells us, because of all the people in his time that said, you dare not go in that ark. You dare not build it. You dare not do it. So Noach stood up to them. Said, I'm warning you to improve and to change your ways and to become better human beings because God's going to destroy the world. We could prevent it by doing teshuvah. They don't listen. So God says to Noach, okay, you're going to enter the ark in midday. Everybody will see in broad daylight. And let's see if they can stop you. You know, if you have a good imagination, try to put yourself into Noach's sandals for a moment. How must it feel to behave so radically different than everyone else around you? How long could someone keep that effort going? Imagine all of the opposition, the demonstrations, the toy-toying that could have been happening. How does Noach stand up to that? From what source did Noach have that moral fortitude, the courage to stand firm in the face of all that adversity of all the other people of his time? And so, my friends, this is the answer that we see in our parsha. That when Hashem calls Noach a tzaddik, God is heaping him with praises. The praises that God gives Noach, that's the source of his strength. That's his greatness. When the Torah calls him great, that gives him the courage, that gives him the strength. When the Torah says that Noach is a righteous man, it was giving testimony to the inner will of strength that he had within him. And maybe he didn't see it himself, but by God telling him that he's righteous, oh, that made a tremendous difference. When we sing other people's praises, we encourage them, put a smile on their face, tell them how good they are, and how much better they can become. So the Torah is not lavishing praise just to give Noach honor. The Torah doesn't do that for Avraham or Sarah or Yitzchak or Rivka or Yaakov or Moshe or Aaron or anyone else. The Torah is making known to Noach, to him, how great of a person he was, that he has the strength, that he can muster the courage to overcome. It's causing him to recognize his greatness. The words of praise are not calling attention to what already exists. Maybe it is, but the point, at least from this angle, from this perspective, is that it creates the ability for Noach to overcome the challenges, the obstacles, the struggles, the adversity that he has in his time. How? By singing his praises. When you sing somebody's praises, you bring out a whole new personality in them. That's what you're doing. So, and this is, I'm sharing with you from the teaching of the Rebbe. It's a popular idea out there. That, that we oftentimes, we react according to the expectations of others. Right? We've been enraged, upset, or jealous because we know that is what society expects of us in certain situations. When we are complimented, somebody praises us, it helps us to gravitate towards those positive qualities that was highlighted within us. Reminds me of the story of a girl who overheard her principal referring to her as a girl who has character. And that pushed her, inspired her to greatness. And years later, she found out that she misheard. The principal said, that girl's a real character. And yet, when she heard what she thought she heard, that the principal said, that girl has character, She didn't hear that the principal said, that girl's a real character. She heard the principal say, that girl has character. Somehow spiraled her into changing and becoming a better person. So from that perspective, when Noach is setting out to complete the hardest task of his life, God reminds him of the qualities he has inside. That he is a righteous person, he's perfect, he walks in the ways of Hashem. Noach. You are different than everybody else out there. God is reminding him, they may be immoral and corrupt and promiscuous and terrible, wicked, sinful people. But you, Noach, you're a tzaddik. You could overcome these challenges. And that gives the strength for a person to overcome. When God bestows these compliments on Noach, it gave him that spiritual energy to overcome the challenges that he faced. That's the Rebbe's perspective. That's the way the Rebbe saw these words. And I think in life, that's something, reminds me of a story, again, of the Rebbe. There's a rabbi, it was quite a famous Chabad rabbi, Rabbi Bero Baumgarten. He was a Chabad emissary, the Rebbe's emissary, to Argentina for many years. Before that, he recalled he was a teacher at a yeshiva in New York. And once they had a get-together, a gathering on Shabbos, and Rabbi Baumgarten noticed that one of his students smelled of cigarette smoke on Shabbos. Think about that. You know, on Shabbos, it is Lo Tavaru Eish, the Torah says. Do not ignite a fire. A father of blessed memory would say not to ignite a fire of discord, of ribbels, of conflict. But literally speaking, the verse is saying, don't light a fire. You can't light a cigarette. Rabbi was not sure how to deal with it. So he wrote a little note to the Rebbe, asking the Rebbe's guidance and advice. The Rebbe's response was swift. He said to him, go see Avos the Rabbi Nassan, chapter 12. So he looked it up. And what does it say there? It talks about Aaron HaKohen, who was Ohev Shalom, Verodev Shalom. How it's a commentary on ethics of our fathers. It talks about how Aaron would love peace and pursue peace, loved all creations. And so Rabbi Nassan's commentary on that is, metaphorically speaking, or maybe factually, historically, I don't know, but he would say that Aaron, how would Aaron behave when he heard of somebody misbehaving, transgressing, committing a sin? Says Rabbi Nassan, he would seek the sinner out and give him a great big hug. And he would tell the sinner, what a wonderful person you are. And afterwards, the sinner would think to himself, I'm such a wonderful person. Aaron thinks I'm such a wonderful guy. How could I behave like that? That's terrible. How could I transgress? How could I violate the Torah? Similar story when somebody asked the Rebbe, how does the Talmud say that all Jewish people are filled with mitzvahs like a pomegranate's filled with seeds? It says, really? Even the words of the Gemara is, "Afilu Poshe Yisrael," even the sinners of Israel. Man said, how could a sinner be filled with good deeds? And the Rebbe looked at him and said, I also studied that piece of Gemara. My question is the opposite. How could somebody with so many good deeds be a sinner? It's all a matter of perspective. And the message the Rebbe was telling Rabbi Baumgarten was that the job description of an educator is to convey to the student the great heights that they're capable of reaching. When my father would wag his finger at me when I would misbehave and say, it's pasnisht, it's unbecoming of you. What was my father telling me? You're better than that. It's a positive way. Educator doesn't need to tell students about how bad they are, even though we do that. That's what we were saying before. We're very critical of others. We're self-critical too. And maybe because we're self-critical, that's why we're critical of others too. The Rebbe was telling Rabbi Baumgarten, an educator needs to tell the student the capabilities they have, how good they really are, and how much better they can become. When you encourage a person, that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. You shower them with praise. Say, I'm so great. How can I behave that way? So That's, a child needs to have an adult who thinks more of the child than the child does of themselves. So, my friends, with that in mind, I think this explains this idea why the Torah waits until Noach needs to build an ark before it offers that praise. Why we didn't see that praise in last week's Parsha. Before Noach begins this divine mission that he was charged with to build the ark, Hashem showers him with praises. God accentuates his positive potential in order to ensure that he has the strength, the fortitude, the ability, the energies to overcome the challenges, the obstacles that he would face, and that he could achieve his goals. And if we could take that perspective, then we understand that we could inspire others and ourselves as well. On a side note, you see, when we read about Moshe Rabbeinu, very peculiar question that the Gemara asks about Moshe. Very end of Moshe's life, after 40 years of selfless devotion to the Jewish people, shepherding them through the wilderness. Remember, he prevented their annihilation after the golden calf. And yet, Moshe is punished. And he's told that he wouldn't enter the land of Israel. Instead, they'll be led by his successor, by Joshua, Yeshua. What does the Torah say? I'm not going to go into all the details, but remember the story where God tells Moshe to speak to the rock, and instead Moshe hits it. How does he get punished for that? Right? We all know the story. Isn't it quite harsh for Moshe to be punished for hitting the rock instead of talking to it? What exactly was the terrible sin that Moshe did? What difference does it make if Moshe speaks to the rock or strikes it? One of the commentaries explains that the punishment obviously doesn't apparently fit the offense. There's many commentaries. I just want to bring this one to mind. That Moshe was not being punished for his failure to follow God's order of speaking to the rock instead of hitting it. His punishment was completely something else. Moshe spoke disparagingly of his fellow Jews when he called them rebels. He says, Mamri Mayisam, he calls them. He says, you guys were rebels. Says the Akedas Yitzchak, one of the commentaries, Moshe was punished for speaking harshly of his people. A leader cannot speak harshly of his people. A leader needs to remember that each and every individual possesses positive as well as negative qualities. That's the human makeup. That's the way we are. And most people are very well aware of the negative qualities. The job of the leader is to remind others of the good that they have. That can be forgotten throughout our struggles in life. We have to remember that. As my mother of blessed memory would tell me in life, you're going to build and others will destroy. Try to build anyways. We each have the potential. We each have to realize the potential of our words, that they could create and they could destroy. A compliment, a word of praise creates positive ripple effects. And of course, when we criticize, a nasty comment creates negative feelings. We have a few more minutes. Let me conclude with two stories that come to my mind. One is of the Rebbe Rashab when he was a young boy. Two sons of a Rebbe, Rashab and Razah, Shalom Dov Ber and Zalman Aaron. Zalman Aaron was older but was shorter. One time he was playing with his brother, and his younger brother was taller than him. So he pushed his brother down. Later, his father, who witnessed this incident, turned to the two of them. And he said, I want you to know in life, there's always two ways of becoming taller. I guess you could always take hormones. What do they call them? Steroids. He didn't offer him that option. He said, You could stand on a chair and you'll be taller, but don't ever push someone else down, because that won't lift you up. And this is an important lesson for life. We shouldn't push others down. Remember the broken tile syndrome. Don't look for the flaws in others. See the good. There's a story in the Gemara about one of the great sages, Rabbi Yeshua ben Prachya. What does he say in Pirkei Avos? Aseh lecha rav, every person should have a teacher, a master, a mentor. Uknei lecha chaver, we should all acquire friends for ourselves. And then his final teaching is that they done as kol adam l'kaf zchus. We should always judge people favorably. And the Gemara discusses this. Why did he give this teaching? To judge others favorably. The Gemara tells us, you know why? Because he once judged one of his students unfavorably, and it had a terrible detrimental effect. The Gemara tells a story that it goes back to the time of King Yanai. It's actually a Sukkah story. King Yanai was a Tzeduki, a Sadducee, and he came to the temple on Sukkot. And what was the story then? I think they were pouring the water. They poured it on his feet instead of onto the altar. I'm not remembering. He did something wrong, and the people pelted him with esrogim, and he killed a lot of the sages. So because he was a heretic, he killed a lot of people, thousands of people. Anyways, at that point, Yeshua ben Prachya ran away. He went to Alexandria in Egypt, and eventually came back to Israel when it was safe. But on the way, he stopped off at a hotel with one of his students, and at the hotel, the student was commenting on the beauty of a woman. And the teacher said to him, Yeshua ben Prachya said, "How dare you look at other women? Telling me about other women. I'm in the presence of my wife." So Yeshua ben Prachya was displeased with the student for looking at the beauty of another woman instead of his own wife. And he chastised him for it. And the student came back many times asking for forgiveness. And he came once during a time when Yeshua ben Prachya was saying Shema, so he couldn't forgive him. And it says that the student rebelled. Some people say that student was Yeshua HaNatzri, the founder of Christianity. I'm not going to go into all the details of the story, but the point the Gemara tells us, you know why JC became who he was? The Gemara is telling us is because his teacher, Yeshua ben Prachya, was one who criticized him, who spoke negatively of him, and that turned him off of Judaism, and he went and founded a whole new religion of Christianity. Again, the story obviously has many other details within it, but the point of the story is that because his teacher was critical of him, that's why he became a rebel. And what we're learning today is that we have to try to raise people up, not to tear people down. So that's the shiur for today. I want to encourage all of us, in whatever way we can, be more sensitive, caring, kind, be more lavish in our praise and less critical and condemning and criticizing of others. Let's be more positive. We'll create a more positive world. I want to share with you one more story that comes to mind. And this story is one that certainly emphasizes the idea of the positive effects of speaking praise rather than condemnation. I want to read it to you from my phone. It's a story that is just a story I recently read, and I think it's worthwhile to share with you. I don't know who the author is. Let me just read it to you, and we'll take it from there. He says, "I was born in Brooklyn shortly after the war to parents who were Holocaust survivors. Although we were not Hasidim, I attended the local yeshiva in my neighborhood, which happened to be the Lubavitcher school. I was not the best behaved child in my class. I caused my parents much agmas nefesh, aggravation. It got so bad that at a certain point, I started to zone out in class, not making any effort to pay attention to my teacher's instruction. I was just floating through the school without making any progress in my studies. One day I caused a disturbance in class, and my teacher had enough. He sent me out of the classroom and told me I was not welcome back until I learned a portion of Mishnah by heart. Where was I? That thing just covered my place. I can honestly say that the portion of Mishnah I learned that day was the only piece of information that remained with me from that year. I simply didn't care about my studies, but this I was forced to study. This all occurred when I was 12, shortly before my bar mitzvah. As my bar mitzvah approached, my father sat down with me one day and told me that in honor of the special day, he had arranged a private audience, a yechidus, with the Rebbe, to receive the Rebbe's blessings in honor of my bar mitzvah. He informed me that the private audience would take place the following evening. Now, although we were not Hasidim, we had great respect for the Rebbe, and I looked forward to a private meeting with this great holy tzaddik. The next day at school, I proudly told my classmates I would be meeting with the Rebbe tonight. To my surprise, they took this news quite seriously. Don't you realize that the Rebbe asked, traditionally the Rebbe would ask bar mitzvah boys about their studies. We're all careful to prepare ourselves before our bar mitzvah, yechidus, before we have this meeting. What are you going to do? What are you going to tell the Rebbe you study? I realized I was in big trouble. First of all, I would be embarrassed. What really bothered me was my father, though. He would sorely be disappointed with my complete lack of knowledge. I loved my father dearly. I felt terribly for him. But it was too late. Tonight was this meeting. The rest of the day passed in a daze. I wished the earth would just open up and swallow me in. Well, the day passed, and soon I found myself sitting with my father, waiting to enter the Rebbe's office, and there we would be in his study. My father sat there proudly. I sat next to him, filled with dread. Finally, it was our turn to enter. The Rebbe greeted us with a smile, spoke for a few minutes with my father. Then he turned to me and asked me which book of Mishnah we were learning in class. I knew the answer to the question. Then, to my surprise, the Rebbe asked me if I studied a particular Mishnah. I had. It was the only Mishnah I had learned the entire year back when my teacher had punished me. I was dumbfounded. I answered every single question that the Rebbe asked me. Finally, the Rebbe gave his blessing for my bar mitzvah, and that audience, that personal meeting was over. When we left the room, my father lifted me in the air. He hugged me. My dear son, he said, today is the happiest day of my life. Never before have I been so proud of you. From that day forward, my life changed. And today, look where I am. That's the story. I just read this story, and I just thought, what a beautiful story. It had so many lessons. You know, obviously, whether it was the Rebbe's Ruach HaKodesh, that he knew which Mishnah to test this boy on, or I doubt it was the teacher that called the Rebbe about it, but either way, the sensitivity of the Rebbe, his love, and the way he asked the child about that one Mishnah that the child knew. And just to think about that story. The kid writes about, the guy saying, I was a terrible student, I misbehaved. But the Rebbe asked him the questions only on that one Mishnah, that one teaching that he knew. And I think of this story. The Rebbe was telling this boy, you have those qualities within you. You don't have to focus on your negativity, on your misbehavior, on all the other misconduct and everything else. The true essence of this child was what you learned, what you knew by heart, by testing him on that one part. The Rebbe was reminding the boy of his true potential. And I think to each of us, isn't that our job as parents, as educators, as teachers, as grandparents, as as friends is to try to lift up those around us, to remind them of their true potential, to instill within them the knowledge that you're really pure inside, that we all have the ability to live up to those standards. I think that's incredible. What do you think? Okay, leave you with that thought. Zaykas everybody.